In 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch stood in front of the Great Sphinx of Giza. He wasn't an Egyptologist. He didn't care about pharaohs or dynasties. He looked at rock, and what he saw terrified the academic world. The official story. For nearly a century, every textbook said the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC by the pharaoh Khafre. It has Khafre's face, supposedly. It fits perfectly into the 4th dynasty construction boom at Giza. Age: 500 years, case closed. He saw deep, rolling, vertical fissures, undulating erosion channels. To a geologist, this pattern is unmistakable. It's not caused by wind-blowing sand, which cuts horizontally, that it's caused by water. Specifically, heavy, prolonged rainfall running down the walls for thousands of years. The climate problem. Here's the issue. Giza is a desert. It has been a hyper-arid desert for roughly 5,000 years. Since the time of the Pharaohs, it has barely rained. To get the kind of deep water erosion Schoch saw, you need a climate that Giza hasn't had since the end of the last ice age, the Neolithic wet phase, or even earlier. We're talking about a time when the Sahara was green, when monsoons hammered North Africa, that ended around 3000 to 5000 BC. To get that much erosion, the Sphinx couldn't have been carved in 2500 BC. It had to be standing there, carved and exposed to the elements, while the rains were still falling. His conservative estimate, 5000 to 7000 BC. The implications: if Schoch is right, history breaks. In 7000 BC or 10,000 BC, there were no pharaohs, no pyramids in Dynastic Egypt. Humans were supposed to be hunter-gatherers or primitive Neolithic farmers. We weren't supposed to have the organization, technology, or will to carve the largest monolithic statue in the world. It means the timeline of human civilization is wrong. The academic war. When Schoch presented his findings in 1991, the backlash was instant. Egyptologist Zahi Hawass famously shouted, No single artifact, no single inscription or pottery or anything has been found until now in any place to predate the Egyptian civilization more than 5,000 years ago. It was geology versus archaeology, rock versus culture, and the fight hasn't stopped since. Let's look at the evidence that convinced a Boston University geology professor to risk his career. It's carved directly out of the living bedrock of the Giza Plateau. This means the walls of the enclosure are the same age as the Sphinx body. Wind/sand erosion creates sharp, horizontal layers. Think of sandstone canyons in Arizona. It scours soft layers faster than hard ones, creating a layered cake look. Water erosion. Water runs downhill. It follows gravity. It finds cracks, widens them, and creates smooth, rolling, vertical channels. Schoch argues the Sphinx enclosure shows textbook precipitation-induced weathering. The rolling profile, the hard and soft layers of limestone in the enclosure don't jut out sharply as they do on nearby Old Kingdom tombs. Rolling. Schoch claims this cambered profile only happens under chemical weathering caused by water soaking the stone. The comparison: nearby, there are tombs cut into the same limestone during the Old Kingdom, circa 2500 BC. These tombs have been exposed to the same wind and sand for 4,500 years, but they don't show the same vertical fissures. Their corners are sharper, their weathering is horizontal. The tombs were cut later, after the climate dried up. Rock weathers from the top down. The longer it's exposed to air or water, the deeper the weathering penetrates. Around the Sphinx, weathering penetrates 6 to 8 feet deep. Around Old Kingdom structures, weathering penetrates only 1 to 2 feet. This suggests the Sphinx floor has been exposed to the elements much longer than the Old Kingdom structures next to it. The head problem. Schoch admits the head looks different. It's less eroded. His explanation: the head was recarved. Originally, the Sphinx might have been a lion or Anubis. The head was massive, proportional to the body. Later, perhaps by Khafre in 2500 BC, a pharaoh decided to put his own face on it. He carved the eroded lion head down into a smaller human head. This explains why the head is too small for the body. The head shows less erosion than the body, and the head looks dynastic style, while the body looks older. The conclusion: geologically, Schoch says the case is solid. The erosion features are characteristic of rainfall. The depth of weathering implies great age. The comparison with nearby tombs shows a chronological gap. To a geologist, the Sphinx is an ancient monument that was already old and eroded when the pharaohs found it. They didn't build it, they renovated it. If the geological evidence is so strong, why don't archaeologists accept it? Because archaeology isn't just about rock, that it's about context. And the context of the Sphinx screams 2500 BC. The Giza Plateau Plan. The Sphinx isn't sitting alone in the desert. It's the center of a massive, integrated complex. It sits directly in front of the Pyramid of Khafre. It is aligned perfectly with Khafre's Valley Temple. The Sphinx Temple is built from the limestone blocks removed to carve the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple use identical architectural styles. The complex is a single unit. And we know the pyramids are 2500 BC. The missing civilization. This is the biggest problem. If a high civilization carved the Sphinx in 10,000 BC, where is the rest of their stuff? Where are their settlements? Where are their pottery? At 10,000 BC, the Nile Valley was inhabited by hunter-gatherers. They didn't carve 20,000-ton monolithic statues. Archaeologists argue, you can't have a Sphinx without a civilization to build it. The alternative erosion theories. Geologists who disagree with Schoch propose other ways to get that erosion without 10,000 years of rain. 1. Salt weathering. Haloclasty salt crystallizes and expands, popping off flakes of stone. 3. Wet sand. Wet sand could chemically weather the stone. 4. It did rain. Occasional heavy flash floods could have cut those fissures in a few centuries. The Occam's razor argument. Archaeologists say, we have a pharaoh, Khafre, who built a pyramid right there. We have temples next to it in the same style. We have no evidence of any earlier civilization. We have geological mechanisms, salt, that explain the erosion in 4,500 years. Why invent a lost Atlantis-style civilization when the standard model works perfectly? Geologists say archaeologists don't understand physical rock processes. They are talking past each other. For years, archaeologists used the missing civilization argument to crush the Sphinx water erosion theory. Hunter-gatherers couldn't build megaliths, that it's impossible. Then, in 1994, everything changed. In Turkey, Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site called Göbekli Tepe. The discovery, he found massive, T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles, carved with sophisticated animal reliefs, weighing up to 20 tons, oriented to stars. The date, carbon dating confirmed the site was built around 9600 BC. It's exactly the time frame Schoch proposed for the older Sphinx. The impact, Göbekli Tepe destroyed the argument that Ice Age people couldn't build monuments. They could. They did. They moved massive stones. They organized labor. And they did it without metal tools, pottery, or farming. The connection, Schoch and others seized on this. You said 10,000 BC was impossible. Göbekli Tepe proves it's possible. The Sphinx Temple mystery. Remember the Sphinx Temple? The one built with 200-ton limestone blocks removed from the Sphinx enclosure? It looks nothing like standard Egyptian temples. It looks stark, massive, megalithic. It looks a bit like Göbekli Tepe. The paradigm shift. Göbekli Tepe didn't prove the Sphinx is old, but it removed the impossibility barrier. It proved civilization, or at least monumental architecture, is thousands of years older than we thought. Suddenly, the idea of an ancient, rain-eroded Sphinx wasn't geologically plausible, but archaeologically impossible. It was geologically plausible and archaeologically possible. The question remains, if Göbekli Tepe exists, why not a proto-Sphinx? Maybe the Sphinx wasn't a lion. Maybe it was something else. The water erosion hypothesis, once dismissed as fringe, now sits in the shadow of Göbekli Tepe, asking a haunting question: how much of human history have we missed? The water erosion theory doesn't stand alone, because if the Sphinx dates back to 10,500 BC, it aligns with a completely different kind of evidence that connects the monuments of Giza directly to the stars. In the 1990s, author Robert Schoch proposed the Orion Correlation Theory, arguing that the three pyramids of Giza are not randomly placed, but are a terrestrial map of the Belt of Orion, with the two larger pyramids matching the bright stars Alnitak and Alnilam, and the smaller, offset pyramid of Menkaure matching the dimmer, offset star Mintaka. He calculated that the only time this ground plan perfectly mirrored the sky, with the Milky Way matching the Nile, and the Sphinx facing the constellation Leo rising at the vernal equinox, was exactly in the epoch of 10,500 BC, the same time frame Schoch's geology suggests. This creates a powerful dual argument where geology points to the heavy rains of the Younger Dryas era, and astronomy points to the specific celestial alignment of that same era, suggesting the Giza Plateau was laid out as a massive pre-dynastic clock, freezing that specific moment in stone. Critics argue this is pareidolia, pointing out that the angle of the pyramids doesn't perfectly match Orion's belt without inverting the map, that the Leo alignment is speculative, and that Egyptians in 2500 BC had their own stellar alignments targeting the northern circumpolar stars. Furthermore, if the plan was laid out in 10,500 BC, it would mean the site sat unfinished for 8,000 years, a gap in continuity that archaeologists find impossible to accept without physical evidence of that intervening culture. However, Graham Hancock and other proponents argue that the site might have been a sacred astronomical marker for millennia, preserved by a priestly tradition that eventually culminated in the dynastic construction projects, implying that the pharaohs didn't design Giza from scratch, but inherited a legacy they merely completed or restored. This perspective transforms the Sphinx from a simple guardian of a tomb into the oldest component of a grand, prehistoric observatory designed to track the 26,000-year cycle of precession, anchoring human history to the movement of the cosmos itself. To bypass this, researchers have turned to more experimental techniques like surface luminescence dating or cosmogenic nuclide dating, which measure how long rock surfaces have been exposed to sunlight or cosmic rays. However, these methods are complicated by the fact that the Sphinx has been buried in sand for most of its history and repeatedly cleared, resetting or confusing the exposure clock, and making definitive results elusive. Robert Schoch has proposed that the only way to settle the argument is to find organic material sealed beneath the deepest erosion layers or inside the core masonry of the Sphinx temple that could provide a definitive pre-dynastic date. But permission for such intrusive sampling is almost impossible to get from Egyptian authorities. Meanwhile, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe has shifted the burden of proof, forcing archaeologists to admit that monumental stone working existed in 9600 BC, yet they still maintain that Giza specifically lacks the cultural footprint, the pottery, settlements, and tool fragments that always accompanies such activity, creating a paradox where the Sphinx looks geologically ancient but sits in an archaeologically young neighborhood. This leaves us in a scientific stalemate where geology says old and archaeology says young, and neither discipline has the silver bullet to disprove the other, meaning the Sphinx remains a chronological anomaly suspended between two different versions of history. This hypothetical lost civilization would have existed during the end of the last ice age, a time when sea levels were 400 feet lower and massive areas of habitable land, like Sundaland or the coastlines of the Americas, were above water, suggesting that their main population centers might now be submerged on the continental shelves, explaining why we find so little evidence on land. Graham Hancock calls this a species with amnesia, arguing that a global cataclysm, possibly the Younger Dryas impact event around 10,800 BC, wiped out this advanced culture, triggering floods, rapid climate change, and megafaunal extinctions that forced the survivors into a dark age from which it took humanity thousands of years to recover. In this narrative, the Sphinx and Göbekli Tepe are not the beginnings of civilization, but the last desperate memorials of a dying world, built by survivors trying to encode their knowledge in stone before the darkness fell, which would explain why agriculture, mathematics, and monumental architecture seemed to start abruptly in Sumer and Egypt without a long developmental curve. They were restarted, not invented. Archaeologists dismiss this as fantasy, pointing out that we have continuous sequences of hunter-gatherer artifacts from this period that show no break in continuity and no evidence of advanced technology. Yet the allure of the theory remains powerful because it offers a coherent explanation for the anomalies, the water erosion, the precision stonework, the sudden appearance of high culture, suggesting that the history we learned in school is just the post-apocalyptic reboot of a story that began much, much earlier. Whether you believe the Sphinx is a 4,500-year-old masterpiece of the Pharaoh coffer or a 12,000-year-old remnant of a lost Ice Age culture, the monument itself remains the ultimate witness to the human story. Having stood silent while empires rose and fell, religions were born and died, and the very climate of the planet shifted from green savanna to hyper-arid desert. The debate over its age is more than just a squabble about dates. It is a battle over the definition of human capability, asking whether we are the first advanced civilization to walk the Earth or merely the latest in a cycle of rise and fall. Ultimately, the Sphinx keeps its secrets because it was designed to last longer than the civilizations that study it, surviving erosion, vandalism, burial, and excavation with an impassive gaze that seems to mock our attempts to pin it down to a specific century. As we continue to develop new technologies, we may one day force the rock to speak, but until then, we are left with the visual evidence of deep fissures that look like tears cried by the stone itself, suggesting that this guardian of the Giza Plateau has seen more rain, more history, and more of humanity than our textbooks are ready to admit. The mystery is not just when it was built, but what it knows that we have forgotten, standing as a permanent question mark at the gateway to the ancient world.